Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel Lashed to Death, where I talk about true crime cases I have been obsessing over for years. My name is Tracy, and today we're going over the case of the Oklahoma City butcher. But before we get started, if you are true crime obsessed like me, then you don't want to miss an episode. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button so that you get notified every time I upload a video. And don't forget to leave your thoughts about this case below. We love reading those, and if you have any ideas for any cases that you would like for me to go over, please drop that down below too. So when I was deciding on what case I wanted to do as my first episode, I wanted a case that was local to me, and never did I think that one local case would lead me down a rabbit hole of many horrific cases. I had no idea that happened in my own state. Oklahoma has had its fair share of murders, kidnapping, sex trafficking, but the number one thing, sadly, that we're known for is the April 19th, 1995 Alfred P. Murrah federal building bombing that killed 168 people. However, Oklahoma has not been known for one thing, and that's having a serial killer. Or have we? This episode features descriptions of graphic violence which may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is absolutely advised on this video. So, the Oklahoma City butcher is an unidentified serial killer who murdered 3 women between 1976 and 1986 in Oklahoma City. The killer murdered, dismembered, and mutilated young, homeless Native American women. So on April 1st, 1976, 3 oil workers from a drilling site in Oklahoma were beginning to grow impatient as they waited for a colleague to show up to direct them to their work site. Soon, impatience turned into boredom, and guys do what they do, and they looked for something to do in the meantime while waiting. The 3 workers noticed an abandoned house that was clearly in great despair and hadn't been lived in for some time. The house was located at 325 Northeast 6th Street, which has since been demolished and apartments have replaced it. So back in the 70s, Oklahoma City, downtown Oklahoma City, was a really poor area and low income. Currently, it has been redone and it's absolutely gorgeous. It's really pretty, and we have lots of things to do downtown now. But back in the 70s and 80s, and even into the 90s, it was very low income driven. The houses were dilapidated, they were falling apart, and it was just a really bad neighborhood to be in at that time. So as the men approached the house, they noticed that the front door had been boarded up. So 2 of the men went to the back door, which was not boarded up, and it was unlocked. Just as the 2 entered through the back door, the 3rd man entered through an external hole outside of the house. And they entered roughly about the same time, and all 3 of the men, once they entered the house, they had an overwhelming odor that they would later describe as the scent of death. With the home being in such a dismay of junk, clutter, animal activity, the 2 men who entered through the back door actually tripped over something, and with the rake that they brought in the house with them, they just shoved the item to the side and continued inside. As the men went deeper into the house, they discovered next would be horrific to the most hardened detectives. As they went further inside the house, they used the rake to move items around, and they were just basically stumbling around in the dark. However, they did notice a popcorn bucket from a local movie theater sitting in a corner. Using the rake, one of the men prodded the bucket of popcorn, and it tipped over, and something unnatural rolled out of the bucket. First, one of the men thought it to be the head of a dog, and as gruesome as that sounds, it's much more horrific than that. What rolled out of the popcorn bucket was actually a human head. All 3 men would later say they had a hard time recognizing the object as a human head because of how abused it looked. The men immediately fled the house and called the police, but with it being April Fool's Day, police didn't take it seriously. But when they did show up, however, they soon realized that it was no joke. While the men stumbled on a severed head inside the house, they had no idea the rest of the victim's female body had been dismembered and scattered throughout the house. It would even soon be discovered that the object the two of the men tripped over after entering the house was actually a human thigh. How grotesque and just unnerving is that, to know that you were in a house and body parts were all throughout the house. I don't know about you, but if I walked into a house and it smelled of death, I certainly would not be going further inside that house. Guarantee you that. As if this was not grotesque enough, it was also discovered that the victim's sexual organs were removed and missing entirely from the crime scene. The police would never find the missing organs, which brought them to the conclusion that the killer might have kept them as some grotesque trophy, as he had likely done with one of her hands, which was also missing. So because the police were only able to recover one of the victim's hands, and because you have to remember this was 1976, it made it almost impossible to do fingerprint matching. It was first thought that the dogs or other animals were the reason the woman's body had been torn apart, but after an autopsy was done, it was soon discovered that the victim had been dismembered on purpose, which now opened the door for murder. Although very little is known about the actual case of the death, it was documented that the medical examiner determined that the woman had been dead for approximately 4 weeks and that her face had been significantly disfigured. Whoever committed this act of violence had cut her face, enlarged her smile, extending it from ear to ear, kind of like a Joker fashion that went from here to here. That is so disturbing. Betty Gatling, a sculptor from Norman, Oklahoma, was called in to make a facial reconstruction of the victim, which would later be distributed to enforcement agencies across the region over the next several months. However, unfortunately, it failed to find a match. The woman's identity wouldn't be known for more than 2 decades. The police speculated that this victim had been a white woman between the age of 25 to 35 years and stood between 5 foot and 5'4" with brown hair. However, blood tests conducted weeks later actually determined the victim had Native American ancestry and also indicated a younger age of 18 to 22. Additionally, dental and intestinal testing of the victim revealed that she had likely come from a lower economic background, leading investigators to speculate she had been homeless at the time of her murder and very possibly was a sex worker. Due to the location of the house, which at the time was known as Research Park and was known as an area for prostitution. On April 19, 1979, children playing basketball in a park along the 300 block of Northeast 10th Street. This was roughly about 1.5 miles from where the original victim was found in 1976, but at this point that case had already gone cold and practically had zero coverage since it happened. The boys who was playing basketball had brought his dog, and while the boys played, the dog found other things to occupy its time. The boys soon noticed the dog had something in its mouth and ran into the alleyway. Boys being boys, they ran after the dog and they soon discovered it was a human head. The police arrived to absolute chaos from the neighborhood. In addition to the victim's head, which had been severed from her body, it had also been mutilated in the same way as the first victim. Her smile had been extended from ear to ear. It was soon discovered that similar discoveries were being made all over the neighborhood. Unlike the first victim, this victim's body parts had been distributed throughout the entire neighborhood. Over the next few days, police found more of her remains scattered throughout the neighborhood. Some of the body parts were wrapped in bags, newspaper. The body parts had an odd absence of blood because the killer washed them before disposing of them. her left hand, pelvis, shoe, and part of her flesh. So roughly a week later, on April 25th, Oklahoma City police would identify this victim as 22-year-old Arlie Bell Killian. Killian was said to be homeless due to allegedly substance abuse, beatings, and rape at the age of 16 by the hands of her father, Eddie Killian Jr. Arlie did suffer from mental illness and did have run-ins with the police. Although Arlie had been homeless and was also known to be a sex worker, she had never been picked up for prostitution, but had been picked up for substance abuse and vagrancy charges. She was last seen just 4 hours before her head was discovered in the park. So, over the next 2 months, the police found more body parts. Some speculated that the killer was playing a game, disposing of the woman's body parts to toy with the police. After making the original discovery of the victim's head on April 19th, police were called out to the neighborhood numerous times throughout the month to discover additional pieces of the victim's body, which leads to May 1st, when they located the last remains of Arlie, located in 200 block of Northeast 7th Street. This was just 2 blocks from where the first victim was found, which seemed to confirm the killer was familiar to the area. So it wasn't too long before police announced they had made an arrest in the murder of Arlie. Eugene Johnson lived along North Walnut at this time. Johnson was held for a short time in order to get a mental evaluation, and police would insist that Johnson was only being held as a material witness in this case and wasn't a suspect. And shortly after, he was later released from custody and was seemingly cleared of any involvement of this case. While the first murder received a mass quantity of news coverage early on, but quickly faded due to many reasons. Not only was the first victim's identity not known for many, many years later, but the circumstances of the case led it to being drowned out in the press. However, this was not the case for Arlie Killian. Early on, police had been able to identify the victim, and the recovery of her dismembered remains over a lapsed period of time horrified the surrounding neighborhoods, with residents being aware that a woman's severed body parts were being recovered from yards and alleyways. I can imagine the thought of this was just terrifying for the community at this time. Unlike in the first case, police would identify a couple of suspects. Very early on, as I stated previously, Eugene Johnson was considered a suspect in the days after the killing of Arlie Killian, but was seemingly cleared rather quickly. However, one name would raise suspicion in the ensuing weeks with a clear relation to Killian herself, and that suspect was none other than her brother, Perry Lee Killian, who conveniently escaped a mental hospital the same day that his sister was killed, April 19th, 1979. Before he had been confined to a mental institution, Perry Killian had expressed a history of violent and bizarre behavior, which made him a prime suspect for Arlie's killing. Same year the first victim had been killed, Perry had killed and butchered 2 of his grandmother's dogs with a hatchet, and when police were called to the scene, Perry admitted to the offense. He was arrested immediately that day on March 27th, which happened to be days before the discovery of the first victim in the abandoned house on 6th Street. Perry was living with his and Arlie's grandmother on the 17th Street, just 3 miles south across the Oklahoma River. Perry found himself in a mental facility, but was released after only a year, and ultimately led to another incident in 1978, in which he attacked his grandmother with a knife, which sent him back to the mental institution. Now, on the exact same day that his sister Arlie was killed and dismembered, he would break out. Perry Killian was apprehended by authorities on April 24th, just 1 day before police would identify his sister as the most recent victim of the savage killer. Immediately, he became a strong suspect in the case, obviously, for his tendencies of murdering animals. As we all know, that's a #1 indication of a serial killer. Not that in everybody that kills an animal, sadly that's so gruesome though, kills an animal is going to grow up to be a serial killer. But if you go back and you look at the serial killers, you will see that they all have a history of killing animals. So immediately Perry became a strong suspect in the case and was subject to hours upon hours of interrogation, but soon discovered that while he was at the police station being interrogated, Arlie's remains were continuing to be found. So Perry was in police custody and body parts are still being found in the neighborhood, but Perry was in the police station being interrogated. At the same time, police were finding newly discovered body parts that had been randomly placed throughout the neighborhood. So it couldn't have been Perry. He wasn't allowed to make a phone call or anything like that, so he had no contact with the outside world to, even if he was working with somebody to distribute the body parts, he had no way to contact them to let them know that they needed to be distributed or anything like that. So they quickly took him off of the suspect list. So over the next few years, Arlie Killian would go unsolved with police quickly running out of available leads and the community's interest running elsewhere. It was quiet for many years. Then on Thursday, March 6, 1986, a 62-year-old man named Albert Archie was walking through his backyard at 501 Northeast 1st Street. This was less than a mile where the other bodies had been found. This was 7 years after the second body had been found. Archie would make a gruesome discovery. Not only did he find the upper torso of a female along with her left leg and tissue like the other two murders, the body had been dismembered. The body parts were found in overgrown grass behind Archie's home, seemingly dumped there on purpose by an unknown killer. Once the police arrived on the scene, they began to suspect that after nearly 7 years, the infamous OKC butcher had returned once again. This crime scene had all the same markings as the first two crimes. The theory soon would be confirmed within days of the torso discovery on March 12, 1986, when a second grisly discovery was made just around the block of 507 North Lindsay Avenue. The head of an unknown female victim was found inside a garbage bin, which had been intentionally set on fire. This discovery, just behind a garage in an alleyway, revealed this killer was just haphazardly disposing of the body parts throughout the neighborhood, likely wanting to draw attention to his crime. The final victim was 22-year-old Tina Marcia Sanders, a homeless Native American woman. She was quickly identified because of her tattoos. She was last seen just a day prior to her death. Within weeks of her death, police felt comfortable linking the crimes publicly for the first time, that one killer was behind all three murders. The cases were all similar in how the victim had been dismembered, scattered throughout neighborhoods within a 2 to 3 mile radius, and all three women were Native Americans. So, weeks after the murder of Tina Marcia Sanders, police linked her murder to murders of the two previous victims. Police believe that all the victims were killed by a single person. All of the victims killed, dismembered, and mutilated in a similar manner. The first two victims had a unique cut on their lower lip. All of the victims were beheaded, and the victims' sexual organs were removed and never found. Furthermore, all victims were young, homeless Native American women who was believed to have worked in the sex field. However, in 1993, another suspect would emerge in the form of Henry Lee Lucas, a convicted serial killer from Texas who would eventually be linked to hundreds of crimes across America. Lucas, who would become known as the Confession Killer, notably committed a series of murders and violent assaults between 1960s and the 1980s, but confessed to a dozen of other crimes over prolonged. Police believe Lucas was buying time for Bones, likely in an effort to delay his pending execution. After being arrested in 1983, Lucas started confessing to murders throughout America, and one of the murders he confessed to was Arlie Killian. Oklahoma City police detectives met with Lucas on several occasions, interviewing him and hoping to gather more information about his potential involvement. Over time, however, it was discovered that Lucas was attempting to confess to as many crimes as possible because it allowed him to escape daily prison life and receive benefits that other inmates did not receive. Some of these benefits included like coffee, cigarettes, the ability to travel the nation going from one crime scene to the other, and to cooperate with prosecutors, which would keep him alive after receiving a death penalty. Eventually, Lucas would be discredited for many of the hundreds of crimes he had confessed to, which included the Arlie Killian case. Journalists and authorities have discovered that it would virtually be impossible for Lucas to have committed a majority of the crimes that he confessed to, because they were committed simultaneously thousands of miles apart from each other. So it was just virtually impossible for him to be in two places at once. It was later discovered that Lucas had been allowed to see investigators' files that included details about these crimes, making it super easy for him to confess and to actually know the details about the crimes that only the killer and police would know. In 2008, Kyle Estridge, a cold case detective for the Oklahoma City Police Department, spoke to the Daily Oklahoma, saying that Lucas died in prison in 2001 and was no longer viewed a suspect. Estridge would go on to say that they did have a record of Lucas being in Oklahoma during his travels, but Estridge believes it's someone within our own community because he is so brazen and he's so familiar with his surroundings, and he's super comfortable with spreading body parts throughout a neighborhood during the day. The first victim remained unidentified until 1993, when her cousin Andra Medina reported her missing to the police. She got in contact with Sergeant Norman Adams, who connected the missing Kathy Lynn Shackelford to the unidentified woman. They were later confirmed to be the same person after DNA testing. Police would never reveal a cause or manner of death for either of them. The bodies of the second and third victim had been scattered throughout a neighborhood. This was not the case for the first victim. She was found in an abandoned house along with her dismembered body. Police speculate that the killer had planned on coming back to scatter the remains, but the oil workers found her before the killer could come back. It was later revealed that the victim's missing body parts would eventually all be found except certain body parts, and those were the sexual organs. These have never been found, and police believe the killer kept these as trophies. Police would commission the FBI to help create a psychological profile of this killer so that it would help in his apprehension. Although not much of the profile has been open to the public, investigators would reveal that the killer is likely a recluse, likely psychotic tendencies, which, surprise, surprise, that wouldn't surprise me, psychotic tendencies, and he possibly has a mental health condition. I don't think that that's a far stretch to say any of those things, actually. Because of the violence perpetrated against these three women and the withholding of their sex organs by the killer, we can probably be safe saying this hatred is likely sex-related. And because the bodies were found in a 3-mile radius, the killer felt comfortable in his surroundings, that most likely he lived in the neighborhood. The 7-year gap could be due to getting married, raising a family. If you're familiar with the Dennis Rader case, he went several years without killing anyone, and that's because he was a family man and he was raising a family. So the absences of his crime sprees, the gaps in them, was at the time when he had his children, or his children were getting married, things like that. So he had a gap in his, and they're saying that this is similar to that he could possibly have a gap in the killings for the 7 years because of, like, he could be in the military, he could be incarcerated, he could be raising a family or something like that. And although the serial killer has not ever been identified after 40 years, someone has actually came forward within the last 2 months saying that they are the daughter of the Oklahoma City butcher. So stay tuned for part 2 of the Oklahoma City butcher and the mysterious woman claiming the OKC butcher was her father, and she says she has proof. Until next time, everyone, stay safe and be aware of your surroundings, and you have a great day. Bye.